Hey everybody, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I'm here with Francis Pulham, who's the author of T-34 Shock. The link in this is of course in the description below. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about T-34 against aircraft. So I personally went to the archives, I looked at a couple of Luftwaffe documents, and they had specifically testing of Mk101s and Mk103, so 30mm anti-tank guns. Used by the Luftwaffe, and they did some penetration testing, right? And first of all, what was sort of, from your knowledge, what was the experience of the Soviet army in terms of German Luftwaffe attacks against sort of these tanks and what they would usually do?
Luftwaffe attacks against tanks was generally more effective with bombs. So obviously, especially in the early war period when the dedicated ground attack aircraft aren't as common, we're firing with guns. Aircraft like the Stuka dive bomber turned out to be a far more dangerous threat to armour than the ground attack aircraft with cannon. When you look at the losses of Soviet tanks to aircraft, especially in 44-45, when we've got the G variants of the Stuka with the 37mm cannons and the Henschel HS-129, the losses are incredibly low. Maybe 5 or 6 tanks a month are lost to air attack. It's not a lot at all. More tanks are lost per day to other tanks, anti-tank guns, rockets from infantry than aircraft. Aircraft at that point of the war become more of a nuisance, and obviously the Luftwaffe loses air superiority in sort of the middle of 1943 as well. So aircraft are generally less of a threat for tank crews. It's not something that they're immune from, absolutely not, but it's not as big a threat as ground units.
That's interesting because we see, of course, the Luftwaffe initially, of course, using bombs against tanks because that's all they have. Then they develop these anti-tank guns because they think they're going to be more effective. On paper, they are if you hit. But of course, in practice, it's a little bit difficult. And then they're sort of transitioning back to bombs and rockets as well, because they notice that, especially on Focke-Wulf 190s, they can't mount those big cannons, and they start using bombs and rockets again, flying numerous sorties. And I think I have some files that say, like, when you compare sort of the 190 sorties against tanks and the Stuka sorties. Stuka sorties, like you were saying, it was just minimal damage inflicted on the Soviets. What I find interesting is there is a report by the German Heer, so the army, that says when the gunpowder Stukas were introduced, they really didn't like that, because with a bomb, you're not just really endangering a tank, you're also shell-shocking the crew perhaps, and also you're damaging or you're a danger to the infantry that comes with the tanks, whereas with the gun pods, you're only a danger to a tank, right? And you're not applying that suppression across a field when you throw 250, 500 kilogram bombs. Is there sort of this popular perception that we have of these Soviet assaults with tanks, with infantry? Do we see sort of there being doctrines and also in place to defend against air attack between the infantry and the tanks?
In the pre-war period, certainly. Tanks in the pre-war period had anti-aircraft guns integral to the turret in anti-aircraft gun mounts. Infantry would work in tandem with tanks, and anti-aircraft guns, mainly Maxim quad machine guns, were brought up with the tanks during an assault. During the war, Soviet anti-aircraft doctrine changes a little bit. You do have things like the K-51 85mm anti-aircraft gun, which eventually gets turned into this. But you also got the 37mm anti-aircraft guns and dedicated anti-aircraft guns on tractors. When German air superiority is at its strongest in 1941, like you say, it's the bombs that are causing the big issue. And it's not necessarily a direct hit that might take out a tank. So we look at the 21st Tank Brigade's assault on Kalinin in October 1941, October 17th. The 21st Tank Brigade are ordered to, unsupported, assault the city of Kalinin, which has just been taken by the Wehrmacht, and liberate it on their own with no infantry. Not quite sure how they were supposed to do that. However, they did a very good job, and they did a 100-kilometre march up the Kalinin highway. But once they were discovered by the Germans, they were attacked by Stukas, which were actually stationed at the Kalinin aerodrome. One of them being Hansa Grudel, which is quite a nice little thing. And the tanks that were knocked out by aircraft in that engagement, bombs didn't necessarily hit the tank. They would hit the road in front of them, the tank would then fall into it, and then you've lost your tank. So a bomb is a nice big area effect weapon that can not only affect the tank, but the infrastructure around the tank that it needs to drive. if you look at, like you say, you look at then the anti-aircraft, the aircraft with cannon, and the Soviets do the exact same with the Sturmovik. They like the idea of being able to use a aircraft as a flying anti-tank gun.
Yeah.
Like you say, what they find is the Soviets find this out as well as the Germans, that it's not as effective as an area effect weapon.
Yeah.
You are only really targeting the tank. And on paper, these guns are really effective, but they're very hard to aim.
Yeah.
And you've only got limited ammunition. So if you've only got 3 seconds looking at a target down a reticle before you're too low to the ground and have to peel away, the likelihood of getting a hit on that is actually very low. If you do get a hit, you are likely to cause penetrations, but what the Soviets found was that the penetrations were small enough and the damage was light enough that within a couple of days the tanks were back in action. Unlike a tank that maybe got hit by a bomb, which would obviously be totally destroyed, or a tank that fell into a hole in the ground and potentially burned, that does a lot more damage to the vehicle long term. You're less likely to get it into action.
Yeah, I guess that's also the sort of the discussion we can have then on what is a kill, right? Is it a mobility kill? Is it a bailout kill? Is it actually a complete kill with a fire erupting, explosions going on? And obviously the kill claims that come from these engagements there. What I find interesting as well is if we sort of look at this discussion of bombs against tank guns. Obviously the Germans, they have this large number of anti-tank guns that they want to then place on aircraft. They go all the way up to 7.5 centimeter guns, which they put on a Ju-88. It fires a couple of times in the air and it comes back, cracks at the fuselage. The windows of the canopy have been shattered by the test firing and so on. Obviously that doesn't work, but it's a very sort of clinical approach that once again in testing it looks perfect. And I have a video on this with the MK101 as well, where you can see sort of they tested it on an early T-44 with the old turret and these, I think it's 76 mil gun, right, and a KV-1, and you do see sort of, okay, so they penetrated once in the turret here, once in the hull there, and that sets off a fire and so on. But in actual reality, achieving those hits, it's nowhere near as likely as during testing. And there was one test I saw with a Focke-Wulf 190 strapping one MK103 under each wing, and it was so unstable to fire that you would hit an area that is maybe 10 by 10 meters, which doesn't sound like much, but if you put one tank in there, plus add smoke, sort of the something is firing back and so on, you're not actually going to be able to hit it.
Yeah. Well, you can have some really good parallels with what the Americans did in the 70s and the 80s with the A-10 Warthog.
Yes.
They realised that if you're firing one bullet every second, like you could in World War II, you're not likely to hit a target. The acceptable impact range is 20 meters around the vehicle.
Yeah.
The Americans realised if you put a Gatling gun or a gun that can fire lots of ammunition very fast, you might shoot 150 rounds and they might hit in a 20-30 meter pool.
It looks impressive.
But you're still going to get 1 or 2 hits on that tank. You're more likely to then hit it and destroy it. Yeah. So like we're saying, it's very difficult to hit the target. And the technology, in my opinion, just wasn't there in the wartime period for precision anti-tank, precision flying anti-tank work. Yeah,
and there's also, since you brought him up, Rudel, of course, he gets credited with, 500 kills or so on. Obviously, we know that there's going to be a plus minus attached to that because most of them are just claims. But then when you sort of look at the other Stuka pilots, right, and I have this beautiful sentence somewhere in the protocols of high-level German talks from 1944 where I think it was even Milch, if I remember correctly, he said, well, Rudel knocks out so many tanks, but why can't, and I don't imagine every Stuka pilot has to do the same, but can't every second Stuka pilot at least knock out half of them? And that really shows you sort of you maybe have this one guy that is able to do this, but on a whole, at a sort of force level, that really is the exception.
If you want my opinion as well on Rudel, he was a fantastic Stuka pilot, especially in the early war. Some of his feats were, sinking the battleship Murat. Yeah. He's a very good pilot, but I also think that he becomes a propaganda piece.
Oh, absolutely.
And cocky, like all pilots do. You talk to Douglas Bader or see interviews with him, and he was a very cocky man. Like his achievements were great. I'm not taking that away, but you've always got to take, I think, that with a pinch of salt.
Absolutely.
And Rudel and his anti-tank work, I think all you need to do is look at what the other pilots were achieving and realise that even if he is scoring higher than the rest, he's not this amazing ace I think that he liked to portray himself as.
No, and he also gets portrayed by other people like this. But like you were saying, the kill figures and it's a lot more sort of claims rather than kills, but it gets taken as that. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about the vulnerabilities of the T-44. Let's imagine it is actually being hit by something like a 37 or a 30 mil gun. Aiming, of course, one of the things that we have, okay, so German pilots are supposed to ID the aircraft, the tank that they're shooting at first, right? Is it KV-1? Because then they should come in at a shallow angle. Is it the T-34? They should come in a 45 degrees angle because mainly of the hull to neutralize that angle. The engine deck, I guess, is the first sort of vulnerability we should think about. What's the armor plating on here? Ignoring the fact that there's obviously open holes.
So the thickness of the plate on the roof here is only 20 millimeters thick.
Yeah.
So it's actually the thinnest part of the tank, along with the floor plates. In early T-34s, the floor is even thinner.
Okay.
So yeah, this is undoubtedly the most vulnerable piece. However, certain areas of this hull are actually double skinned.
Okay.
So what you're standing on, for example, is an armoured cover for the fuel caps.
Okay.
But that's a 20 millimeter plate on a 20 millimeter plate with a gap of about half a foot.
Oh, so it's like space armor essentially. Yeah.
Unintentional space armor, yes. This central bit, however, this protrusion is just 20 millimeter. That's access to the engine.
Okay.
But you can see that either side of it does have a little bit better protection. The elephant in the room, obviously, though, is this grille, which, yes, has armoured louvres to protect the air intakes, but you're still opening the transmission hatch to a potential enemy fire. Yeah.
But I mean, hitting something like this, which is essentially 1.5 meters plus, 40 centimeters in width, from a moving platform onto a moving platform, with the Stuka has 12 rounds in each gun.
Yeah,
it's got to be difficult.
Oh, it's incredibly difficult. In the gun reticle of the German aircraft, these tanks would have looked like peas.
Yeah.
And it's only when you get close can you really identify them. So I like the idea of they had to identify the tank before they attacked
it. If they can,
if they could, because all you're going to see most likely is a cloud of dust.
Yeah.
And when these vehicles are running, you can see how filthy I am and how filthy the tank is. They just kick up muck and dust.
Yeah.
So from the air, you'll be able to see a column of vehicles moving, but you might not necessarily be able to know that they're tanks until you're on top of them.
Yeah, and that's also sort of one of the advice that I see in a lot of German documents is like, whatever you're shooting at, just try to aim below the turret, because it's sort of the most obvious schematic you can make out in the chaotic nature of combat.
I think it would be very, very difficult to aim at specific areas of a tank. You would probably put the centre of mass in the centre of the reticle and just start shooting.
Yeah, exactly. Talking about sort of the penetration points maybe on the sides, because that's where the Germans tested it, right? I did see, if we sort of move down a little bit here, let's maybe stand here for now. Let's talk about the turret first.
Sure.
So one of the results that I saw in the testing is that if you sort of hit in the back turret area, obviously there's going to be the ammunition behind that, and that usually causes some damage, with potentially setting off the ammunition. At least that's what the report says. And over here, it's assumed that the crew is mainly going to be at risk. Does that sort of more or less check out with your experience, or sort of how the internal layout is?
To a degree, yes, but the crew is kind of from the radio antenna backwards. The gunner is sitting far lower in the tank, but he's still no more forward than the bulge. That's the electric turret traverse area, and you think that's where his hands are. So most of the crew are actually in the rear part of this turret. So I can understand that aiming for this part, even if you're not going to get an ammunition cook-off, you're more likely to kill those inside the vehicle than if you was aiming at the front. And also the armour on the turret of a T-34 is thicker at the front. It's 90 millimeters at the front, tapers to 75 at the sides.
Okay, so it tapers actually along the turret.
Only a little bit, but it's enough to make a difference.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Of course, during the testing, they didn't actually have anybody inside, so that's always a little bit of an assumed thing as well. Looking at this, obviously, as we were saying, in theory, if you identify it as a T-34, if you can, you're supposed to come at a 45-degree angle, very clinical. You're not going to do that in real combat, to neutralize sort of the angle of the armor plating here, which is, again, actually, if we stand next to it, it looks like a massive part of the tank. It's not that big once 500 meters that way, coming down at an angle. What sort of sits here that could potentially knock it out? I guess the engine on the backside?
Yeah, so
the rear of the tank?
First of all, the plate is 45 millimeters thick here, so it's the same thickness as the glacis plate. And that's not particularly thick armour, especially coming in at that angle from an aircraft. So inside the T-34, you've got towers for the vertical springs, and you've got 4 of them.
Yeah.
Some of the bolts you can sort of see where they go. But then between them, you've got fuel tanks, oil tanks. So if you get a penetration where a fuel tank is, there's a potential there for a fire. Like you say, you've got the engine in the centre of the engine deck. Either side of the engine, you've got a vertical radiator, and then more fuel tanks either side.
Okay, and ammo, I guess, if you were going to penetrate it, there is storage on the bottom. There is the story about, I think it's with the Sherman, right, with the wet ammo racks that would neutralize the chance of a detonation. I guess on the T-44 that's not the case.
No, so there's no wet storage in here. The ammunition that's not in the ready racks at the back of the turret or next to the driver, it's all in bins underneath the floor, and they're not even armoured bins, they're just metal crates essentially. You've got to get through the armour to get to it, but a penetration through here, through the fuel tank, out the other side would hit the ammunition, and you could absolutely cause an internal explosion by striking that.
Without sort of talking about the fuel and the engine, how likely is it, for example, to have a mobility kill by hitting the tracks and the wheels? Is that a possibility?
Oh, absolutely. Track is delicate. We see tanks driving around, kicking up mud, going over obstacles, but the reality of it is that if you damage a link, it can snap, or if you get the right hit at the right angle, you can jam up road wheels, drive wheels, you can hit the transmission, not even the internals of the transmission, you can hit the sprocket that the wheel goes onto. So any kind of hit to the suspension is potentially an immobilization kill.
And that goes back into this discussion, what is a kill? And also, if the tank is immobile, how useless or how useful or how useless is it in combat? I guess it's still a standing pillbox in many ways, but for the crew, being under air attack, especially if they're green. One of the reports that we see, of course, from the Allied Air Force in 1944 is that they don't necessarily need to knock out a tank, they can just immobile it, and the effect of air attack panics the crew. They bail out, they run into the explosions, they run into the machine guns, and they're actually leaving a relatively safe space, let's say, for them, that they should just, if they could just stay in the tank, they would actually be a lot safer rather than that panicky running into where actually all the explosions are happening.
I think that a tank is definitely a projection of power, and that goes for both an army and the individual crew. And I think that especially as a green person who may not understand the minutiae of combat, if you start taking hits and you realise your tank is taking damage, the faith in your tool suddenly drops.
Right.
No, you can
oh God, we're vulnerable.
Actually, this big armoured box that is a projection of power is actually also a big armoured coffin in the right eyes. And I think even myself, and I've been crewing tanks now for a couple of years, if I was starting to be shot at, even by a machine gun, I'd want to get the hell out of there.
Yeah, of course. Okay, yeah, fantastic. I mean, that contrasts a little bit sort of the theory and the actual practical reality of air against tanks. Francis, thank you very much for giving us the tour here, and I have contrasting some experiences as well. Of course, if you're interested in Francis' book, T-34 Shock, we'll have that in the description below. And as always, thank you very much, and see you guys in the sky.